Settlers, Chapter 4, Section 5. The Contradictions of White Labor. The issue of a shorter workday spread enthusiastically among the white workers between 1866 and 1873. During these years, the 8-hour day struggle held first place in the activities of white labor. With considerable foresight, the leaders of the National Labor Union had seen the need for such a single issue to unite and discipline their immature followers. At the founding convention of the NLU in Baltimore on August 20th, 1866, the call was sent forth for all white working men in every region, trade, and industry to combine on this and one front, quote, "The first and great necessity of the present to free the labor of this country from capitalistic slavery is the passing of a law which by 8 hours shall be the normal working day in all states of the American Union." End quote. Throughout the 60s and early 70s, the 8-hour day movement grew, with immigrant German socialists playing a leading role in organizing 8-hour leagues in all the major cities of the empire. Literally millions took part in the strikes, parades, and rallies. By 1868, 6 states, led by California, a number of cities, and the federal government had passed 8-hour day laws, the last only applying to federal employees. In 1872, when the New York City building trades won a 3-month strike for the 8-hour day, a festive parade of 150,000 white workmen took over the main streets of the city. But this campaign folded like wet cardboard during the Depression of 1873 to 78, when it turned out that the capitalists had no intention of honoring any promises, agreements, or laws. The white trade unionists found their hours of toil increasing, while their pay was steadily slashed. Not until the CIO and New Deal in the 1930s would white workers attain their goal of the 8-hour day. Defeat, however, is not the same thing as failure. The 8-hour campaign was a success for white labor. It was a new stage of unity, the first empire-wide, coast-to-coast political campaign. As such, it marked the historic point where the swelling settler masses emerged upwards from their earlier pre-industrial small craft consciousness and entered the industrial age. That campaign was the first time white labor actually achieved a broad national unity in action. This was evident at the time. Alexander Kennedy, head of the San Francisco Trades Assembly and leader of both the 8-hour campaign and the National Labor Union, said, quote, "By far, the most important result of this 8-hour agitation, to those who look forward to the day when labor, organized and effectively drilled, shall assume its legitimate sphere in the body politic, is visible in the marked improvement in the character of the men engaged in the movement. A few years ago, the working population of California were in a chaotic state, disorganized, and at the mercy of the capitalists, with very rare exceptions. Today, nearly every branch of skilled industry has its own union, fixing its own rate of wages and regulating its domestic differences. A spirit of independence and a feeling of mutual confidence inspires its members." End quote. Of course, when Kennedy talks about, quote, "the working population," he isn't referring to Mexicanos, Chinese, Indians, or Africans. He is only discussing white settlers. When he proudly points out how, quote, "every branch of skilled industry has its own union," he means unions of white workers. While he refers to these new unions taking care of, quote, domestic differences, it is interesting that he fails to mention the trade union role in the primary labor conflict of the time, the drive by the white unions to annex the jobs of oppressed workers. This is a curiously right-wing result from such a supposedly class-conscious labor campaign. This contradiction sums up the 8-hour struggle and the Great Strike Wave of 1873 to 77. The 8-hour demand was not only righteous, but it was a demand that hit home to the working people across the widest variety of industries, trades, and nationalities. It became the first truly international campaign of European workers, as the first international spread it to England, France, and all of Europe. The largest single 8-hour demonstration was not in Europe or the US, however, but was in Manila. Filipino workers defied the Spanish colonial authorities and struck in a massive rally of 1 million. Many African, Mexicano, and Chinese workers responded militantly to the call for the 8-hour struggle. And in some areas, African workers took an early lead in stirring up action. But the campaign, instead of uniting working people, furthered disunity. It was no coincidence that no sooner had the early victories of the 8-hour campaign unified and strengthened white labor in California than they began stepping up the attack against Chinese workers. Nor is it true that the 8-hour campaign was the work of noble, class-conscious trade unionists, while the anti-Chinese and anti-African campaigns were the work of some totally separate bands of declassed hoodlums and bigots. Both were the acts of the same hands. All of the individual craft unions, the large federations such as the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor, the local trades assemblies, the labor press, the left organizations such as the Socialist Labor Party and the communist-led General German Workingmen's Association, were involved in these white supremacist offensives. Picture an anti-Chinese cartoon by Thomas Nast, famous, quote, reform cartoonist. It's a bunch of settlers looking at telescopes at a meteorite with a Chinese face. Unlike the experience of other nations, the 8-hour campaign in the U.S. Empire had an anti-democratic character, consolidating the settler masses around pro-capitalist politics. In regard to the pivotal struggle of Black Reconstruction, it is clear that the overwhelming majority of the 8-hour day activists were in the camp of the enemy, while only a minority of a few hundreds of thousands were personally active in killing and re-enslaving Africans. They committed their crimes with the support of the rest of their white kith and kin. Those, quote, advanced workers, particularly the German socialist and radical exiles, who loudly sympathized with the plight of the ex-slaves, didn't stop for 1 hour in their headlong rush to unite with the white supremacist mobs. It was as if to witness a criminal attack were to loudly bemoan the injuries done to the victim, while trying to convince the criminals that they should become partners. The 8-hour campaign, the, quote, anti-coolie, and the anti-African campaigns were not separate and unconnected events, but linked chapters in the development of the same movement of white labor. This young movement, for all its anti-capitalist noises, was unable to resist being drawn deeper and deeper into bourgeois politics. as the National Labor Union was having its first convention and first issuing the call for the 8-hour campaign. 5 representatives of the new organization were meeting with President Andrew Johnson to solicit his support. And when he threw out a gesture towards white labor by ordering the workday for government printers cut to 8 hours, he was hailed as the true friend of the white masses. The leading union newspaper, National Workman of New York City, praised his, quote, practical sympathy with labor. The Philadelphia Trades Council described his administration as, quote, for the benefit of the working classes. When the NLU attacked Black Reconstruction, it was clearly carrying out its part of an unholy alliance with President Johnson, who was the newfound champion of the defeated planter class. If the National Labor Union had begun life with an uncertain attitude towards class struggle, and a desire for the quick, quote, fix of bourgeois political deals, by 1872 it was wholly given over to these illnesses. It completely abandoned mass struggle. Instead, the NLU promoted a, quote, National Labor Reform Party to compete with the Democrats and Republicans. This abortive party was so opportunistic and malformed that it nominated Charles O'Connor, a well-known advocate of slavery, as its presidential candidate in the 1872 elections. The NLU itself perished in this fiasco. But the class outlook it represented continued and flourished. In this period, white labor, although still young, took definite shape. Euro-American labor increasingly found itself pressed to organize, to fight the employers, to demand from the bourgeois state some relief from exploitation and some democratic rights. At the same time, these white working men were also part of settler society, and felt their welfare tied up with the supremacy of the empire. Further, pressed downward by capital, they sought to establish a stranglehold on jobs by ruthlessly degrading or eliminating colonial labor. This consciousness was very sharply manifested in the 1870s, when these white working men became the eager tools of various factions in the bourgeoisie in the mass drives to re-enslave Africans and drive out the Chinese. At the same time, engaging in the most vigorous and militant strike waves against the bourgeoisie. This was a middle position between the colonial proletariat and the settler bourgeoisie, and it had its roots in the middle position of these whites in the class structure. It is important to see why white labor could only unite on a petty bourgeois and opportunistic basis. While white labor had tacked together a precarious political unity based on the commonalities of wage status and settlerism, it was as yet so divided that it did not even constitute a class. In brief, we can point to 4 main aspects of this. 1. White working men were sharply divided by nationality. 2. The upper stratum of workmen, which contained most of the, quote, native-born Americans, had a definite petty bourgeois character. 3. Even the bottom, most exploited layer, who were largely new European immigrants, were politically retarded by the fact that their wages were considerably higher than in old Europe. 4. Immigrant labor did not constitute a single united proletarian class itself, because they were part of separate national communities, German, Swedish, etc., each headed by their own bourgeois leaders. The, quote, native-born settlers, as the citizen descendants of the original English invasion force, still kept for themselves a high general level of privileges. They still thought of themselves as the only true, quote, Americans, while considering the non-Anglo-Saxon new immigrants as foreigners, only a step better than Africans or Mexicans. Among these, quote, native-born settlers, petty bourgeois, property-owning, and small tradesman status was the norm, and even wage laborers confidently expected to move upwards once they mastered the knack of exploiting others. Engels noted in 1886, beginning of quote, "There were two factors which for a long time prevented the inevitable consequences of the capitalist system in America from being revealed in their true light. These were the access to ownership of cheap land and the flood of immigrants. They enabled the great mass of indigenous Americans, for years on end, to, quote, retire from wage labor at an early age and to become farmers, dealers, or even entrepreneurs. Whereas the hard lot of the wage laborer, with his status of proletarian for life, fell mostly on the immigrant." End of quote. Thus, the Irish, Polish, Italian, etc. immigrants had the honor of replacing Africans, Mexicanos, Indians, and Asians as the primary labor force of the U.S. Empire in the North. But the position of, quote, native-born Anglo-Saxon settlers changed little, if at all. The native-born settler masses were still above the nationally differentiated proletarians, still small property owners and small businessmen, still foremen, overseers, and skilled craftsmen. The European immigrant workers, who were promoted to be the new, more loyal proletariat of the U.S. Empire, were themselves very divided and confused. America, as it entered the industrial age, was a literal Tower of Babylon. In the hellish brutality of the mines, mills, and factories, the bourgeoisie had assembled gangs of workers from many different nations, torn away from their native lands, desperate, and usually not even speaking a common language with each other. Engels notes the importance of these national barriers. Beginning of quote. Immigration divides the workers into groups, native and foreign-born, and the latter into 1. Irish, 2. German, and 3. Many small groups, the members of each which can only understand one another, namely, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Scandinavians, etc. And then we must add the Negroes. Sometimes there is a powerful clan. However, the bourgeoisie need merely hold out passively for the heterogeneous elements of the working masses to fall apart again. End of quote. And as wretched and bitter as life in America was for white workers on the bottom of settler society, it was still far, far better than life back in old Europe. The Irish, for example, who became the bulk of the unskilled white labor, were used up under virtually inhuman conditions. Contemporary accounts of the 19th century usually emphasize how Irish laborers on the New York canals, the coal pits of Pennsylvania, the railroads across the Plains states, etc., were kept drunk on cheap whiskey by the labor contractors and overseers, so that they could endure their miserable lives. Along the Mississippi, gangs of Irish laborers drained malarial swamps and built levees for $1 per day and whiskey. An overseer explained, quote, It was much better to have the Irish do it, who cost nothing to the planter if they died, than to use up good field hands in such severe employment. While it is hard for us today to imagine that this could be better than life in colonial Ireland, it was. In 1846 alone, some 1 million Irish died from famine. Those who emigrated did so under sure sentence of death as the alternative. Even for those on the bottom strata of white wage labor, the actual wages were significantly higher than in old Europe. Rural farm laborers, usually the worst paid of workers, earned a much better wage in the U.S. Empire. Marx, as we remember, pointed out in this period that, quote, now all of you know that the average wages of the American agricultural laborer amount to more than double that of the English agricultural laborer. End quote. Further, as European immigrants or poor Euro-Americans, they were still eligible for the privileges of settlerism, and if not for them, then for their children. While this was markedly true for poor whites in the South, it applied with a few modifications throughout the empire. Du Bois points out, beginning of long quote, it must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their vote selected public officials, and while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them. End quote. The other powerful moderating force upon the bottom, immigrant layers of white wage labor, is that they were part of immigrant national minority communities here in the, quote, New World. And these communities had their own culture, class structure, and leadership. The German and Scandinavian immigrant communities were on the whole fairly prosperous, with a very high degree of business and property ownership. The vast farming lands of the upper Midwest and Plains states were in large measure settled by these two nationalities. The 1900 census revealed that there were 700,000 German and Scandinavian-owned farms in the empire then, more than 3 times the number owned by, quote, native-born Anglo-Saxon Americans. The question of the bourgeois leadership of immigrant workers is very clearly shown by the Irish here. Nor was this disconnected with settlerism. The community leaders of the Irish national minority here were not revolutionary proletarians, but ward politicians, police chiefs, mayors, the Roman Catholic Church, etc. It is hardly a secret that during the mid-1800s, the Irish workers of the North, under the leadership of the Church and other bourgeois elements, were surpassed by none in their vicious hatred of Africans. The Archdiocese of New York City, for example, publicly opposed emancipation and undoubtedly helped create the anti-African riots that took thousands of lives during the Civil War. It is interesting that Irish patriots, themselves engaged in the bloody armed struggle to throw off British colonialism, saw from across the Atlantic that their countrymen here were being led into taking the reactionary road. In 1841, some 70,000 Irish patriots signed a revolutionary petition to Irish Americans. Quote, Irishmen and Irishwomen, treat the colored people as your equals, as brethren. By all your memories of Ireland, continue to love liberty, hate slavery, cling by the abolitionists, and in America you will do honor to the name of Ireland. End quote. Despite mass meetings organized to generate support for this message of international solidarity, the full weight of the Catholic Church, and Irish ward politicians and trade union leaders kept the Irish immigrant masses firmly loyal to reaction. There was, of course, then as now, a powerful national tie here towards their captive homeland. Twice the Fenian Brotherhood tried military invasions of Canada, in 1866 and 70, trying to force loose the British death grip on Ireland. Even after many defeats, Irish patriots and funds continued to pour into, quote, the cause. The modern submarine, for example, was developed by the secret Irish clan here, and only later turned over to the U.S. Navy. Irish POWs exiled to Australia were liberated in a spectacular raid across the Pacific. So widespread was the enthusiasm for this daring attempt in the Irish-American community here, that an Irish-American U.S. senator offered to get a U.S. customs ship for the raid if no private vessel could be obtained. This only underlines the process at work. The genuine national feeling towards colonial Ireland was taken over by bourgeois elements, who shaped it in bourgeois nationalist directions, and who used the appeal of, quote, the cause, to promote their own political careers and pocketbooks. This is still true today. What international solidarity means can be seen by the actions of the Patricio Corps, the hundreds of Irish soldiers in the U.S. Army who broke with the Empire during the Mexican-American War. Revolted at the barbaric invasion of 1848, they defected to the Mexican forces and took up arms against the U.S. Empire. In contrast, the struggle of the Irish-American community here for equality with other settlers was nothing more nor less than a push to, quote, join the oppressor nation, to, quote, enlist in the ranks of the empire. The difference is the difference between revolution and reaction. The victorious U.S. Army inflicted barbaric punishment on any of these European soldiers who had defected that they later caught. Some 80 Irish and other Europeans were among the Mexican Army prisoners after the Battle of Churubusco in 1847. Of these 80, the victorious settlers branded 15 with the letter D. 15 were lashed 200 times, each with whips, and then forced to dig graves for the rest who were shot. The U.S. Empire then, at the dawn of industrialization, had two broad strata of white wage labor. One, a true Euro-American labor aristocracy, totally petty bourgeois in life and outlook. The second, an, quote, ethnic, national differentiated stratum of immigrant Europeans and poor whites of the defeated Confederacy, who were both heavily exploited, yet given the bare privileges of settlerism to keep them loyal to the U.S. Empire. once nationally oppressed labor was under the bourgeoisie's brutal thumb. Then white labor could be put into its, quote, proper place. In the wake of the Great Strike Wave of 1873 to 77, the white unions were severely repressed and broken up. The mass organizations of white labor, once so sure of their strength when they were dining at the White House and attacking African, Mexicano, and Chinese labor at the bidding of the capitalists, now found themselves powerless when faced with the blacklist, the lockout, and the deadly gunfire of company police and the National Guard. In taking over the tasks of the colonial proletariat, the new white laboring masses found themselves increasingly subject to the violent repression and exploitation that capitalism inexorably subjects the proletariat to. Thus, the industrial age developed here with this crucial contradiction. The U.S. Empire was founded as a European settler society of privileged conquerors, and the new white masses could not be both savagely exploited proletarians and also loyal, privileged settlers. As the tremendous pressures of industrial capitalism started molding them into a new proletariat, which we will examine in the next section, a fundamental crisis was posed for American capitalism. The experience of early trade unionism in the U.S. is extremely valuable to us. It showed that 1. Trade unionism cannot bridge the gap between oppressor and oppressed nations. 2. Moreover, that even among Euro-Americans, unionism, political movements, etc., inescapably have a national character. 3. The organization of nationally oppressed workers into or allied with the trade unions of the settler masses was only an effort to control and divide us. 4. That the unity of the settler masses is counter-revolutionary, in that the various privileged strata of the white masses can only find common ground in petty self-interest and loyalty to settler hegemony. 5. That whatever advanced or democratic-minded Euro-Americans do exist need to be disunited from their fellow settlers, rather than welded back into the whole lock-stepping, reactionary white mass by the usual reform movements. 6. That trade unionism became a perverted mockery of its original self in the settler society, where even wage labor became corrupted. The class antagonism latent within the settler masses had, in times of crisis, been submerged in the increased oppression of the colonial peoples. Capitalistic settlerism drastically reworked the very face of the land. A continent that was at the dawn of the 19th century primarily populated by the various oppressed nations was, at the end of the 19th century, the semi-sterilized home of a, quote, new Europe. And in this cruel, bloody transformation, history forced everyone to choose, and thus to complete the realization of their class identity. Class is not like a brass badge or a diploma, which can be carried from old Europe and hung on a wall, dusty but still intact. Class consciousness lives in the revolutionary struggles of the oppressed, or dies in the poisonous little privileges so eagerly sought by the settler servants of the bourgeoisie. Beginning of long quote by Lenin. On the other hand, there is the tendency of the bourgeois and the opportunists to convert a handful of very rich and privileged nations into, quote, eternal parasites on the body of mankind, to rest on the laurels of the exploitation of Negroes, Indians, etc., keeping them in subjection with the aid of the excellent weapons of extermination provided by modern militarism. There is, on the other hand, the tendency of the masses, who are more oppressed than before, and who bear the whole brunt of imperialist wars, to cast off this yoke and to overthrow the bourgeoisie. It is in the struggle between these two tendencies that the history of the labor movement will now inevitably develop. End of section and end of chapter 4.